welcome to the 40k Fireside podcast, where we discuss everything to do with competitive Warhammer 40k with your hosts Vic VJ and David Gaylord.
Hello everyone and welcome. Today I'm going to be talking about some of the changes that have happened on the terrain format that we play. So I'm only going to be discussing UKTC here, just as a caveat to everyone. Recently what happened last weekend is we had the ITT Autumn event, which my team won, Team Ignite, and from that they've made the decision to change all of the maps by adding a terrain piece which has made all of the singles maps into the quote-unquote heavy map. So it's quite a big change for the UKTC. I would say that it's definitely a welcome change overall. My honest opinion is that this is a welcome change overall for the entire pack, and I'm going to be deep diving into the terrain formats, well, these basically 3 boards that this affects, and explain how and where and why it would change maybe some of your list decisions and what armies will get stronger on them. For context, I actually played on the heavy version of each of these boards over the weekend. I was playing Black Templars, an army that does better on the heavy boards, and it's definitely an archetype with particularly Fight on Death that will be good and stronger on these boards now with this new change. So why don't we jump into it? And as you can see, this is the new map layout, and these heavy boards are not done on TTS yet, but I'll show you the changes. These heavy boards add a square rectangle, and I believe they are roughly 4x4, I want to say. I think the direct versions of them here, 5x5. So it's a 5x5 sheet, which I am assuming a knight and armiger can fit on, right? And typically, you know, over the last couple of months since these new maps have come out with UKTC, where the middle ruins are very much in the forefront of the board, there has been a pretty big issue of units being able to arrive from reserves and shooting across, right? So I'm thinking about stuff like, you know, Raven Guard is the most standout one, I think, at that one. You know, Sisters was very popular at Coventry we just played, and being able to arrive and shoot from reserves is very good there. But more so, I think Tau is probably the big problem child here, in the sense that they don't start on the board. However, they have extremely good movement patterns where they can move and shoot onto your objective. So this does help tackle those problems. And as you can see with the square 5x5 that has been added, it does cover somewhat of the objectives. So if you want to be more or less hidden, you need to be either within the existing small ruin here or off that ruin. But there's an angle here which I'll show you, which can be quite good for infantry against infantry, that I found out when I played against Will in the finals here. So this means that you cannot arrive from reserves and shoot, and you can sort of block a rapid ingress reasonably well. You can imagine if you had a little unit in the middle here on this ruin, you could block a unit arriving from reserves. I'll actually go and show you that right now if that's difficult to follow. It's the wrong one. Cool. For example, if you had an Empress Champion right here, and you can imagine that there was a terrain piece. I'm going to draw a box here. You know, roughly something like this. I'll rotate it. Roughly something like this. You can imagine you can also block a rapid ingress naturally here, because they would need to put a vehicle kind of in this spot here, and then for them to be able to shoot onto your objective or to be wholly on the terrain piece, it's quite far as well. So if my opponent had a repulse execution reserve, I can stay on the objective, block a rapid ingress, and this is a 16-inch natural movement is right here. So that's a 6 on the advance on Devastator Doctrine to get across this. So you're better off at that point, you know, trying to slowly creep it up the board maybe. And as you can see, this creates, for this particular map, an extremely dense objective marker. There is one thing is here, which is really interesting as well, is that effectively these are treated as 2 different terrain pieces, right? So for example, if this square exists here, right, my unit is here, then as long as I don't have a, you know, like my sword poking out past the exterior of this, you cannot actually see into it. Effectively, it creates a U shape, right? Now, I would say this is one of the downsides. this U shape has been problematic, I think, in all elements of Warhammer 40k, right? It's not quite the magic box, but in some ways it is. And for reference, if you don't know what I'm talking about, I'm saying an objective or a ruin which has line of sight blocking walls that create this create a U shape here. So effectively this creates a giant U shape, which is interesting as well. And you can imagine this is really good for an army like Black Templars, for example. I had no losing games on my matrix on the heavy board here. If you've got, say, a unit of assault intercessors, they have great OC. You can be an inch off the wall here, which is another, well, that's a different problem altogether, and I don't think the terrain changes that problem realistically. But you can imagine if you are an inch off, this is quite difficult to attack into. You have to attack over here and here. But this is staged quite nicely, very close to you. So if you have a unit like this, it is extremely difficult to shoot because you need to be on this terrain played wholly. And if you have the fight on death mechanic, you're able to hold this with another unit here. You can have maybe a unit of regular intercessors. Or you can have a regular unit of intercessors right here, blocked by this unit. And if you have these two in combination with each other, fighting on death with your melee unit, where they can't fight your first unit or your unit on the point, it can be very difficult to break this. You don't necessarily need fight on death, but obviously it helps if you've got a unit that can't be shot and can fight on death on an objective, for example. So that's very good. Now, this also blocks some other critical line of sight lines on this map in particular. You can imagine if this didn't exist, for example, there are some quite oppressive lines, particularly when we're talking about things like Raven Guard and Tau, for example. If you have your unit here, I think I have a Raven Guard list here. Once my TTS decides to load. Please. Yes. I'll demonstrate with some Centurion Devastators. You can imagine if you have Centurion Devastators here, if your opponent wants to hold this objective, they need to make it an enormous advance from turn 1. They need to be completely hidden. They need to, basically move 15 inches, which is very difficult for most, if not any armies. And then Raven Guard can obviously shoot right onto this objective. So unless you're in kind of this part of the triangle, you can be shot basically. And if you don't decide to go there, well, then Raven Guard can come right on the side of the board here and then shoot right into this angle. So this was a very problematic angle, as you can imagine. If you're able to move here and then shoot into your opponent's deployment zone, like past this part right here, then you have an enormous line right through here. So for an army like Tau, for example, that could scout move backwards or scout move forwards, then shoot, your deployment zone in this entire area was very open. The reason this was consequently more problematic was that you can deploy a unit here, move to this point, and then this line of sight is open. So you can imagine your only place to deploy here is essentially in this, well, not that part there, but this section of the board right here, which doesn't actually let you play the game in the middle of the board. So this addresses that, which is really nice, right? It cuts off this angle by creating a 5x5 ruin here, about 5x5 square roughly. I'll turn this off. Yep, which makes it very hard to shoot that. So you'd have to get past this point here to shoot in there, which you can have a melee unit obviously kill that. I'm not saying that you can't reach this point on turn 1 to shoot, but you can obviously have a threat to counteractively shoot that on turn 1 as well. So, if you play the opposite player, it means that your opponent can hide a little unit here, and that's good, or they can be against the wall here, but you can kind of threaten them if they want to hide in this box here. So, when I was playing against Will recently in the finals of ITT for my round, he had a great unit, Pathfinders, and I'll use some intercessors to demonstrate this. And this is one angle I didn't really think about. This is the first time I played on the heavy board. He was actually able to, I had a unit of intercessors here, assault intercessors kind of jammed up here that I'd advanced and disembarked onto here. He with his Pathfinders was able to move here and, well, move block me, of course, and then shoot this angle which existed. So I would say this is definitely one to watch out for. There is an angle right here. So it's not as if this is impossible to shoot. If they have a fast-moving melee infantry unit, they can shoot into that. But I would say if you're playing in a tournament recently or a practice game, make sure you cut an angle that's behind this, because then they would have to be over this point right here, or they would have to be on the terrain plate, which makes it significantly further, and you could potentially overwatch them. So something to consider, you're going to need to be able to make a kind of a 10 plus inch movement to get onto that point, but it's definitely something worthwhile considering if you're able to do so. Otherwise, you can put your unit over here, which is probably something I would recommend as well. You might be able to get 2 ranks of Marines so that you don't touch the square here. And that's something to consider. Obviously, that maybe you can't hide that well. So, whilst it's overall, you can see this is quite a very good fix for combat-oriented army for sure. And whilst it doesn't hide all of the abilities to get shot from, it hides the main problematic ones that are from strategic reserves. In addition, it closes the angle off into your deployment zone, so you can't get shot down there on turn 1. Overall, I think this should mean that more combined arms approach armies are going to be a bit more prevalent, and certainly melee armies. And on top of that, shooting only dominant armies should struggle a little bit more, I would say. But there's always that balance between wanting to have enough shooting to keep your opponent honest and actually threaten the board on top of that as well. So you can still play some nice angles, right? Like, for example, you can always put a repulse execution here, and it can go right on that same angle we just talked about and can shoot into there. Obviously, it's in kind of it's in a bit of no man's land there. Or you can push it across once you stage it here onto these angles right here. Or if you go first and they haven't respected you enough, you can maybe sneak it down here. There is an interesting angle that I didn't really talk about actually, which is that, let me just erase some of this stuff, which is that if you have a melee unit, say this is my opponent's objective here, and I've got a melee unit here, all of a sudden actually this angle right here is quite difficult to shoot into. So if you've got a decently fast moving melee unit, you can actually advance them behind here on turn 1, right? Maybe roll a decent enough advance. And actually this angle is quite difficult to shoot into now. Your opponent would have to have something here, which they could move, maybe you are against the wall like this, like that. They would have to have deployed it where they couldn't be shot on turn 1, supposedly. And then they would have to reach past kind of this point right here, which is not exactly easy to do. So you can stage a melee unit here now and not be shot across this angle down the board line here. So it creates another staging point, which I think is actually, I don't know if that was intended, but it does actually mean that you can put like a unit against your opponent's expansion, so it doesn't have to make a long advance. So if they are planning on just putting a unit on the back of their expansion, you can imagine if your opponent just puts a melee unit on the back here, you would have to still make quite a long charge. It's still like over 16 inches away. But if you do go first and you get a big enough advance, you can stage some regular Marines or something that moves faster against that, for example. You can imagine if you're playing Space Wolves, maybe, you could deep strike your 10 Terminators on your home field, maybe, and put some Thunderwolf cavalry against this point, ready to contest that. That would be nice. Okay, that's a bit of a deep dive on the sweeping engagement. It's fresh in my mind because I played it a couple of days ago against shooting armies. And we'll go over the Coventry recap with our games later on. Okay, next up. Got the right tab again. Let's go on to the next map. This map is interesting as well. I played this against Jack Tite, the winner of Coventry, to a 10-10, although I did lose in singles points after making a big blunder on turn 3 after trying so hard to not make that blunder for the first 3 turns. But it happens to all of us. Okay, so you can see this map is a little bit different as well. I believe this ruin is in the same place. The small existing ruin, but there is another feature which has been added here, the 5x5 right here. So, how does this make a difference? Well, there's a couple of things. What you'll probably find is the matchups where this will make the biggest difference is where you will be putting units against this plate to block them from being able to move onto the plate to shoot through the plate, right? There's a couple of pros and cons here. This is the only change that has been made. I'm just going to jump into TTS because I'm sure it's going to be easy to demonstrate what I'm talking about here in a second. Okay, so let's load up the map again. So I played Jack Tight on this, like I said before. He was playing Bringers of Flames, the Sisters list, and I was obviously playing more or less just combat, Black Templars. And it didn't seem to inhibit his ability to play aggressive. Obviously his army has got access to advance and shoot, and that's kind of one of the fundamental armies that this is meant to tackle. But it did create for some more interesting games, I would say. So I'm just going to draw the box again, and 5 inches is here. I'll try to get it accurate this time. 5 on the line tool. 5. Okay, so this is hard against the board edge for whatever it's worth. So, what this does is it combats a few key things, right? You can imagine if your opponent has... Do I have a Riptide model? Okay, we'll see in a second. You can imagine if your opponent has a Riptide model and they're able to move it down the board edge and shoot into your deployment zone, it can be really oppressive. Why don't I load in maybe some Ultramarine models? I'll list mine. You know, let's just say these are Redemptors perhaps, or, you know, something that could move fast. You can imagine if your opponent is able to, say, advance a big fast unit, maybe scout move it on top of that, and if this square didn't exist, I'll demonstrate on this side of the board. The zone into your deployment, the line of sight into your deployment zone is extremely easy to get. For example, this cuts off that part of the board, and this is a normal move. Right, this is less than a normal move. So a Ballistic Dreadnought on a normal move from your deployment zone, which you don't really care about getting shot, can see that much of your opponent's deployment zone. Right, that's with a normal move. So you can imagine Devastator Doctrine, maybe I roll a 4, or I move more than 8 base anyway. Now I can see almost all the way into my opponent's deployment zone. Right, so this is with a 12-inch moving model, which is definitely not the fastest of all models out there, right? So you can imagine if you're trying to deploy something in your melee combat army, you're against this on turn 1, and you have to move almost 30 inches with your combat army to actually try and deal with this threat. Clearly that is not possible, and the next turn all they do is move further, and they can see into, you know, the ruin which you're staging into and everything here. So it's not only a turn 1 threat, it's the turn 2 threat when they've staged everything here and can shoot into your only staging point whatsoever. So this change is designed to tackle that, I believe. And it does so quite well, but it doesn't necessarily stop the turn 2 level of aggression, right? For example, let's say your opponent has gone first. What they're going to do is stage everything here, and then simply move across the terrain plate with a model like this, maybe across the terrain plate with a model like that, or maybe like over here, maybe one on the terrain plate, and then another one just over here like this, for example. This plan still does work, right? So what you're going to end up doing is, you know, trying to combat that, right? And there's a couple of ways you can do it. For example, if I just bring in my ETC list again, this kind of interaction here came up a lot with Jack and I when we played, and you end up kind of sacrificing units to shuffle yourself up the board here. Because, for a key fact, let's think about this Ballistic Dreadnought and put a 1-inch marker on it. Okay, this is actually not the largest base size, 3.5. But you can imagine that if you really don't want someone, and they've staged a lot of stuff here, if you really don't want them to move over this terrain plate and see you, then you could jam your Impulsor, for example, right against the wall here. They cannot move within an inch of you, so therefore they can't come over here and shoot you, right? They can shoot you from safety here, but that might be okay, right? Then you've got the ability to stage your other models here, for example, right? Which kind of gives you this proximity. So if you can stage your models here, push any kind of model here, like this is where on this map in particular, it's quite good to have a lone character or just cheap units that you can just put on the terrain plate here and block, or like a really cheap tank to maybe out OC them. But a cheap unit to put on a terrain plate and block a combat lieutenant is a great idea of this. And then that will prevent them from going on this terrain plate so that you can then, you know, charge stuff in this ruin right here. And if they are sitting right back, because you can now charge them, this distance is not unconquerable, right? Inside 15, more or less. So you can do this by deploying right here, where this line no longer exists, and then advancing right here, right? So this is good with an impulsor, for example. That's just a 3-up. So that kind of tackles this issue of people sitting along the board edge and shooting you, particularly into your deployment zone. But it doesn't solve the issue of if you're not going to move block this terrain piece, then they are still going to shoot you for the next turn. So you really need to consider move blocking this terrain piece so that you can stage your melee army into here and here, put some pressure on here, right, and go early on. You know, counterpoint being that if you're the melee player on this board, your expansion is quite nice now, right? For example, if you've got of scouts here that you may have deployed, you know, you've got the option to hang out in here, maybe hang out in here. If you've got a tank, you can actually deploy it completely safely right up here. There's no way to shoot you unless they have deployed here, drive across here and shoot you, right? Which you can counter shoot. So if you've got a rhino here, for example, you know, you can roll like, this is a 5-up, a 4-up advance to get right here. And this angle's really, really tough to shoot, right? So you can counter kind of stage here, which is really nice. And if you've just got units in a rhino here, you know, this is a 3-up advance to get right here. And it's actually quite hard to shoot you now because, for example, getting across here might be more difficult. Or you might be able to jam a unit here so that they have to be on this terrain plate. And if they're on the terrain plate, they won't be able to see your other unit. So the takeaway here being, this change here, you really want to consider move blocking your opponent, just being just off it so that they can't maybe end or across it or stick their barrel across it to shoot another unit. You're going to want to have some cheap throwaway units when you're playing combat against melee armies and if you're playing combat armies against shooting armies. If you are playing shooting armies, you may want to obviously try and jail your opponent turn 1, stage everything here, right? And then go all in on turn 2 with a unit on the terrain plate, another unit over the terrain plate, and maybe another unit that could stick its gun over the terrain plate like that. And you can get all 3 in, for example. Or you may have to go straight down the middle. So, all in all, you know, that definitely makes it more combat friendly, but it's not the be-all end-all for shooting armies, I don't think. It's not as impactful as the last map we looked at on sweeping engagement, where it created a U-shape that you can't shoot into. For example, if you want to hold an objective here, it's obviously still just as hard, right? You know, your opponent can actually with impunity deploy here because you probably can't shoot them on turn 1. Then if they have any kind of decent movement characteristic, they can move here and then shoot your unit that's on the objective turn 1, right? Coincidentally, you can't really deploy your units here because they can get shot down here. So if you're going first and your opponent and you don't have enough shooting to threaten your opponent and they've deployed here and can advance and shoot you on turn 1, that's still going to be tough. You're probably still going to have to stage here or maybe put something really, really small to bait them in to counter shoot you. You can imagine these boards are particularly bad for Raven Guard, of course, as well, where arriving from line of sight and shooting is functionally impossible, right? If you've got, say, an intercessor here, this blocks out. I don't know if it blocks the entire objective. If you have one here, it blocks the entire objective there, and then here blocks right here. I mean, clearly you can't be shot there. So that's really nice. And if you want to hold your objective as a Raven Guard player, as a player against Raven Guard, being able to hold it, you know, like this means that, you know, a Raven Guard player can't arrive and shoot you from this part right here. So this board is definitely denser, and if you are a shooting army, there are going to be some things that you're going to want to tackle in solving these problems. You know, Jack's List worked really well against mine. Units like Retributors are cheap enough, and Sanctifiers are cheap enough where you can kind of kill off a lot of chaff, like an Immolator, for example, and eventually you're going to have the ability to push through and your opponent won't be able to move block you, or they're going to be trading on the objective, which you want to, if you want to try and out-trade your opponent. It's worth noting that if you've got units here to move block people, it's quite good to come out with now, because then you can arrive from rapid ingress behind here on this point. So if you're, say, the blue player here, the teal player, being able to arrive from rapid ingress in this cubbyhole is really, really good. And if your opponent wants to block that, they're going to have to be, you know, maybe on this terrain feature. But if you arrive from rapid ingress here, you get to probably move onto it and shoot as well. So it creates a really nice cubbyhole where you can rapid ingress, something I didn't consider when Jack and I were playing, and he managed to get his Morven Vile unit in there and destroy me. Okay, nice. So that was the second map, and it's worth noting that this map gets played twice, so it's kind of twice as impactful, right? the first map gets played twice if you're making the top cut. So if you're playing a normal 5-rounder, that will have an impact once. Okay, now let's go over to the next board, which is functionally the least impacted board, I think. I think from the community perspective, this was the most problematic board, and Sweep Engagement were the most problematic. So Sweep Engagement and Purge the Foe were by far Sweep Engagement and Crucible of Battle were by far the most problematic boards, right? The least problematic one was this one here. This is the Search and Destroy mission. Let me just check if it's different for... Okay, so there's 2 versions of this now, which I'm kind of curious as to why they've kind of made 2 versions. You can see one for hidden supplies. I'm not against it. One for hidden supplies has this the 5x5 out closer, right? So you can stage a little bit better. And then the one on Take and Hold has got it against the Ruin here. A little bit of differentiation. I'll walk you through my experiences on what I think they would change. But I think the denser one is, of course, the one that has the 5x5 like this out further. So why don't I load it up and we'll run through it. Alright, so this is the board, and this is the layout with it hard connected against the big ruin here. And this does a couple of things. First of all, you can still put your normal deployment here and deploy right here, where your opponent would have to be past this point to shoot you. That's, pretty standard. A lot of players deploy like that now, or they might deploy it right here, for example. And you're still safe, right? Despite being on this terrain feature, you're still safe because the wall actually prevents your line of sight there. Now, what this does is it moves your line of sight blocking out like this. So you can imagine if your opponent is coming from strat reserves, it is very difficult to shoot you again. Additionally, this ruin here, as I've talked about previously, without this square box right here, it is extremely easy to shoot into your main staging ruin if you're coming in from reserves. So the problem with this board was that as a Raven Guard player, for example, it's very easy to drop my unit in here and shoot anything that's staged in this ruin, right? Because if your opponent hasn't sacrificed a unit to block me, I can arrive wherever I want. And if they have their sacrifice unit is right here, then I can still arrive along this board edge right here. And you can imagine if these are some Centurions, right, a little bit bigger, you can shoot right into this ruin right here, etc, etc. So what it meant is that opponents, if you had good strategic reserve shooting, would constantly have to screen out, push out like this, and kind of forego a unit, or they would have to advance and charge onto here, block you out naturally, for example. But then you could still arrive like right here, for example. So not always doable. So this change here attempts to alleviate all that. And it does so by adding the 5x5 square plate right here. And it does a good job of that. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to arrive from strategic reserves and shoot into this. Great. But it doesn't actually solve some of the problems with this board in general. One being that actually this board looks like it has fantastic staging, but what people end up doing most of the time is they put their decent OC unit right here on the back of the objective, and this is just about 19 inches away. So it's within 18, so if you move 9, it's just outside of 18 if they want it to be, and still 3 guys, it's a 9-inch charge from this ruin to the back of their plate right here. And typically speaking, that's what people will do. They're not going to, hold their expansion ruin an inch off here, like this, with units like this, right? They just don't do that. So actually, the distance from this ruin to this objective is much further than it looks, because you have to go all the way to the back of the other objective. Then, if they have a melee unit staged here, if you have to charge to make the distance, they will heroically intervene onto that as well. So, actually, this ruin here is not really in that great of a place for combat armies, particularly because if you're playing a combat into a shooting army, which is the most problematic version of these boards, you have no incentive as the shooting player to put anything inside this ruin. So you may think, great, I can stage my whole melee army inside this ruin, maybe some up here, right? Awesome. But your opponent eventually just has nothing in this ruin, right? There is no reason for them to put anything in this ruin, right? No reason for them to put anything here either. What they're going to do is put everything up along this board edge here, and then shoot onto your objective, put stuff on the board edge here, shoot onto your objective. And likewise, the same could be said down this way. If you were the shooting player, you can deploy here, deploy on the line, maybe aggressively here, shoot, move here turn 1, and then shoot onto their objective turn 2, for example. Completely avoiding their mid-threat right here. Because the objective is in the open completely, your shooting player, all they have to do is have at least some ability to shoot onto this objective in addition, if your opponent has a melee army that's in the middle of the board. So, there are some pros and cons to the way this has been developed, and I don't think it kind of manages the core tendencies of this map. I would have liked to have seen the big ruin overlap the objective, and that would force at least shooting armies to have to put something in the middle to contest primary, so that a melee combat player would actually be able to make the center of the board relevant. Because the outskirts of the board here are extremely irrelevant as well. So the kind of combination that ends up happening here is that this ruin is reinforced, right? And in combat versus combat, that probably makes almost zero difference. But in combat versus shooting, it functionally makes little to no difference as well, only when units arrive from strat reserve to come and shoot you. However, they probably shouldn't be within range to go here anyway. So it can, help your ability to stage here against the wall to attack your opponent's expansion objective, but there are ways for them to also play around that as well. I had this when I was playing Tau, for example, recently, in my round 5. I was playing Black Templars. My opponent had, 2 ghost kills right along the board edge up here, 3 Riptides, 1, 2, and 3, and all they did was go right against the board edge up here, and, eventually once they had killed everything in here, step on the objective, and maintain the ability with Pathfinders to shoot onto this middle objective. I could never get a melee unit, aside from the ones I had deployed here, plus trying to balance going first and second. I could never get a melee unit to go from here, hide, to then maybe try and re-tackle my expansion objective, because this distance is far too great as well. This is 20 inches, right? So eventually you kind of just end up bleeding units onto their objectives to try and contest them. So you end up getting functionally tabled or just shot every turn, and you get your little bit of skirmishing done every turn. So, on this map, yeah, you can get shot less from reserve, and that is good, but realistically speaking, shooting armies still have a very big advantage on this map. Now, if the ruin is in a different position, we can talk about this as well. 2, 5. Oh, what am I doing? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Effectively, this would be the square. This, I would say, is not functionally that much different, because your main staging distance is still this distance from the ruin right here. Now, what it does mean is that if you have a counter shooting piece, you can put it right here, right? And then you can kind of move off and shoot like that. So you can actually deploy more aggressively as the shooting army on this board, right? Which is actually probably advantageous to some degree, right? You can imagine if you're playing a shooting army against a combined arms army, you can deploy extremely aggressively, maybe have something here and something here, which they can't shoot. This angle would be very tough to shoot. So you can even probably have it like this. That angle's impossible. You can deploy on the line here, and they would have to get to this part right here to shoot you. So you can deploy all your shooting assets on the line. You can now move down the board edge here and do your classic shooting army kind of stuff, right? So you can imagine if you're going first as a shooting army, your game plan basically doesn't change on this board. All this does is nerf units that try to arrive from strat reserve and shoot. So that's an interesting change, but I don't think the change on this board is going to be particularly impactful in the matchups that matter. Maybe in the matchups where it's combined arms, we can hide a little bit more. But realistically, people tend to maximize the distance away from everything now. For example, being on the back of the objective and have a heroic intervention, or being, playing the very top sides of the board, the top sides of the board with lone ops and shooting into these angles. I mean, this ruin here is still quite easy to shoot into. If it was scaled a little bit, if it was done a little bit differently, where maybe it was like this, then you could stage something here, maybe have some ability to counter attack your own objective if it gets taken back by shooting, for example. But you can see even this point to here is still, if they're against the board edge here, about 18 inches away. Alright guys, that's been my opinion. Now, what do I think this will impact in the meta? I think armies like Tau are still going to be quite strong on these boards. Now, the sweeping engagement map definitely will have a big impact, but if you've got mobile shooting infantry that can move through the ruin, then you're still going to be fine. I don't think the changes necessarily impact the ability to get shot on turn 2, but it will mean that if your opponent does so, you will have, units within striking range of them quite easily. And I think that's a fantastic change, for example. The Purge the Foe board, I think you're going to need to focus on having the ability to have some chaff units, maybe like scouts, just as cheap as possible, even an ancient, for example, to block people from going onto the terrain piece so that they can't jump on it themselves and shoot into your deployment zone. And then on the search and destroy boards, I don't think it's going to make that much of an impact overall, particularly because if your opponent's very experienced, well, they're going to know to ignore what is in the middle of this ruin and just prevent you from getting onto the objective anyway, whilst being able to shoot here. Your opponent is going to simply move away from you on these boards if they are playing the shooting armies, for example. Let me just try and erase some stuff. Your opponent will move away from you in this part right here. They will move in a giant U shape, for example. And this is what I used to coach as well. You know, if your opponents put everything in the middle, you know, move away from them, right? This is where you want to be, away from your opponent. And then they still have to move extremely far. You know, just put something on your home field objective right back here. This distance is clearly too far. You know, stuff up here is great. Stuff here is great. Up here is fantastic as well. So, that's my conclusion thoughts. I think it's going to be healthy for the meta overall. Some armies are going to get significantly worse. I expect Raven Guard to completely drop off in total. And the melee armies, you will probably need to have a little bit more, a good combined arms approach, I think, more than anything, to try and take and tackle the big shooting armies on some of these boards. Okay, guys, that's been me. Have a good one. See you later.